Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our webinar series called Zero Trust Club. My name is Tarun, Desikan, and I'm joined by Dan Jones. In this webinar, we're going to dive into the basics. What is Zero Trust? I've been a network security product guy for 20 plus years. Most recently, I founded a company called Banyan Security, and we were pioneers in the Zero Trust space. We were acquired by SonicWall late last year, early this year, and today that product is called SonicWall's Cloud Secure Edge. I'm joined here by my friend and former colleague, Dan Jones. Dan, maybe a quick intro before we dive in?
Yeah, Dan Jones. I've been in the IT security industry for about 30 years now. And formerly, I ran enterprise security at Adobe and Cisco, where we deployed some Zero Trust. And then I was with Tarun and Co. as the CSO at Banyan, then SonicWall, and then most recently founded my own company called 909 Cyber.
So let's get going. Why does this thing of zero trust, why is that even relevant today? I feel like the word zero trust has been a lot, just used for so many different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's first of all, not everyone, but many people have a different view of what they mean by zero trust. So for us in the context, we're talking about what I see as the biggest problem in the industry, which is the end users, the devices they're on, and how they access applications and data. So, we're not talking about zero trust from a other person's perspective. It's really the perspective of users accessing apps and data. And the biggest thing to run is, look, all these companies that you see listed here, um, we could have listed 1,000 companies on this slide and probably just only cover the last couple of years of breaches. And the point being here is, look, it doesn't matter how big a company you are, how small you are, whether you're a great brand, whether you're like an unknown player in the planet. Nobody is immune to a breach.
Yeah.
And it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. And don't think these companies here haven't spent millions of dollars year over year on cybersecurity. You can still be breached. So that's why for us, this thing became, back 2017 in Adobe, we came to the conclusion that the way we're being attacked needs a better line of defense. And ultimately, we picked on certain things. We picked on not using passwords. We picked on a device meeting a minimum posture. We picked on actually making it easier to access apps and data that's on premise without using a clunky VPN. We were talking about restricting network level access. There was a bunch of stuff we were doing. And I think these companies, you can do all that stuff, and I think that stuff's important. So for me, the whole zero trust movement, which I think the acronym and the movement and all that stuff has been phenomenal because more people know about this topic. Anyway, let's
And I think just to build on that, I would say zero trust as a security movement has come up because not only are we under attack, but the way we are attacked has changed. So if you go back like 10 years or when I first started my career 20 years, everyone was pretty much working from the office. And if you're working from the office, your first line of defense is, swipe your badge to get into the office. And then everything was kind of built around the office network. So it was kind of hard to get attacked in this specific cyber way. But now, if you look at it, your applications are in your cloud, your users are working remotely. And so the types of attacks have changed, which means more and more companies are under attack. Like the most common attack nowadays is a business email compromised or a phishing kind of based attack targeted at a very specific individual. And protecting against that is actually really hard. If someone says, I'm going to go after Dan, I'm going to reset his password, I'm going to go after his email, that's the kind of attacks people do nowadays, right?
Yeah, well, so we spend at 909 Cyber, we spend a lot of time with our clients on strategy, and you're hitting on this point. The way that our workforce has evolved over the last 10 years has been significant, because what happens is people were building security programs around, I'm on the network, I'm coming through the building, and I can see what's going on because I'm going to make sure that you're on our wire. Now, as for me, 10 years ago in Adobe, we were beginning to buy more and more cloud first applications. So these SaaS apps, like think of like Workday, right? Well, before Workday, you had this on premise, clunky old application like SAP HR.
SIP.
Yeah. So as we were going through the early 2000s, we were moving to a cloud IDP. We were a very early Okta adopter, right? So we were doing that stuff. We were then moving apps into the cloud, like the Workdays of the world or Office 365. And before COVID hit, we were already doing our zero trust deployment. We called it Zen because we knew that 60% or more of our employees were not in the office on a full-time basis.
Right.
So even before people got sent home because of COVID, we were already looking at scenarios where most of the workforce connects regularly from outside of the office. So if you want one dashboard, one place, one throat to choke to see like what posture you've got, the desktop, the laptop, the endpoint, how these users are accessing it is really where the game's at. So it's user identity and device identity. 80%, when you look at this slide, you're like phishing and these kind of attacks, business email compromise, they're like 80%. So
Yep.
if you can fix 80% of your risk by deploying one platform, wouldn't that be a good move?
Well, maybe I just want to. So if you 80% is one number, but the other number is many high risk attacks actually don't even come from your core full-time employees. And many of these high risk attacks come from vendors or contractors or maybe offshore developers, folks that have access to your systems, but you don't control their devices. You may not even control their income fully. So
Yep.
they may only be partially assigned to you to work for you. And so one thing to keep in mind is the landscape has changed, not just in terms of the types of attacks, but also the types of users that work for companies has changed pretty significantly.
Yeah, and that's so I worry less about, so I don't worry as much about insider theft and insider attacks because the predominant attacks are the outsiders, and when they're going to attack your company, for us, here's a great example. At Banyan, Adobe is our customer. And if you wanted to attack Adobe, then maybe an easier way would be attack Banyan.
And we have a good example. If you remember how Okta got hacked about 2 years ago, they didn't actually hack Okta. Okta had outsourced its support to this company, which had presences around the world, but in that case was based in Latin America, in Colombia. And they went after the support, outsourced support. And the outsourced support had admin access to all of Okta systems. So they were able to compromise Okta.
And that's why for the last couple of years, you've heard people talk about supply chain security a lot more. Like, what's your SBOM? Who do you rely on? Who are your third parties? And whether you are using it as part of a product you're delivering or as part of your support process, or maybe you've just outsourced marketing people to some outsourced company, and they've got control of your Twitter account or your social media accounts, and all of a sudden they're taking over and posting stuff that's negative towards your brand. So I think there is this whole anyone can be attacked. The methods to which we're being attacked are pretty contained. It's the phishing, it's this password account compromise and stuff like that, people clicking links. So it's that's an easy thing for us to focus on. And then as you get further down the conversation, the reality is okay, how do I prevent them clicking links? How do I make sure the posture in the device is good enough before they access my data? And then because I've got these things in play and because I'm publishing my applications, internal apps, I'm publishing them to the internet almost for this workforce to use. That means the internal office networks, we can play around with those.
But before we get there, can we talk a little bit about the impact? So, we've discussed everyone's under attack. the way you get attacked has changed. But what about the impact of these attacks? What does that look like when someone gets,
Yeah. So it depends. Right. Okay. So I would hate to be a really small security company that's in the password manager space and then get breached, because that is your only one job as a security vendor, is to also apply security within. Because if your platform is breached, then you're not a very good security vendor. And if you're a smaller size company, that can be detrimental to your business. So from that side, I think that's important to understand. But when you think about the cost of the incident, the marketing, the lawyers, the whatever, the cost of a breach is in like for I think IBM had a survey. We got a slide here, talks about this, which is about $4 billion or 4 million. I don't know, Tarun. The next slide will tell us. It's very, very expensive. And and kind of like any part of security and running a business, it is less expensive to plan for something and to think about how you're going to build a strategy and execute a strategy to keep you safe than the shit's hit the fan, and then all of a sudden you're responding and you're throwing money out the door because you're bringing in the wrong people,
yeah.
or you're bringing in the most expensive person when you didn't necessarily need that. So the way you respond under duress to any situation in life is a lot different than when you can take your time, you can plan, and you can have a strategy for in the event of, or other strategies to prevent it, hopefully.
Exactly. I think the discussion we've been having so far is, hey, listen, that everyone is being attacked, but they're being attacked in slightly different ways than what you might be expecting. They're being attacked in pretty simple ways. They're being attacked
Yes.
by targeting specific users. They're being attacked by targeting your the links you click, the emails you read. But the impact can still be extraordinary, even though the attacks are fairly, simplistic. The impact is on your company brand, on systems going
Yeah.
down. Uh, the most recent attacks, actually bring down utility networks. People use electricity for days, and so the impact is just not on your online presence. Like, it's not just your website that goes down. An attack can have full impact on your bottom line, and even maybe a country's bottom line. What I was telling you before is one of the most interesting attacks, or one of the most interesting threat responses I've seen this year was in the Red Sea. We discovered in the last 2 years or so that has become the hotspot, the Middle East conflict, is piracy has been on the rise in the Red Sea. And everyone was really shocked, like how the Houthis have been able to target just high value ships, consistently target high value ships over the last 2 years. And they were able to track all of this back, like the cyber insurance guys were able to track all this back to a hack that happened 5 years ago in one of the shipping agencies' content management systems. So, the Houthis, essentially in Yemen, were just watching shipping manifests being uploaded into this simple WordPress website from 5 years ago. And they knew exactly which high impact targets to go, attack with their relatively small boats. So the impact of these attacks can be like really enormous, even though the starting point is fairly simple.
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? Is you may be breached this year, and there's a couple of things. You may be breached already and not know it, but you may be breached in a way where you think you've dealt with the breach, and then 3 or 4 years later, you find out there's all these knock-on effects.
Yeah.
So the reality of any breach is you have, you've got the breach will occur, and then you're trying to contain and understand, and then you're trying to make a plan to kick them out.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you're also assessing like what is the extent of this breach. And you could be in a situation where you're under attack and you can see the attack come in. And I'll give you an example. Like during our time at Adobe, we were always under attack. And there was this one time where we're watching the attack happen, and at the same time, nationals from that country's armed forces were looking up my account on LinkedIn.
Wow.
And so it's a nation state attack. They're looking me up over LinkedIn. You can see them try to attack my team. So the team that dealt with all of Adobe's root certificate, you could just see them try and attack the team. You could see them. Yeah. So without going into the details, you understood like who your attacker was. You knew where they were based, and
Yeah.
then you knew their OPSEC wasn't that good because they're looking at my bloody account on LinkedIn, and I'm like, holy shit. And then but then if I spoke to people in my team, they were looking at some of their accounts as well. So they are they have the everybody has, you know, they have the ability to attack very specifically. But then you've got the other kind of things like ransomware attacks. They're not necessarily, they're going after numbers. They want
Right.
the more people to click this stuff. They want that knock-on effect. Sometimes ransomware will be targeted, but some of these crews and, you know, ransomware as a service made it more, you know, available and stuff. So some of these people just go after a wide spray and pray, you know.
And maybe let's get a little bit more specific, right? Let's talk a little bit about how a typical attack happens. So far, it's been kind of generic, but let's talk a
Yes.
little bit about how a reasonably, you know, just a generalized attack might happen, and we can get specific about when we say zero trust can protect you or zero trust can help you, what we mean.
Yeah. You know, first of all, I love this slide. For me, I don't know who made it, but they were a genius. Uh, so yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things we're trying to depict here, right? So and somehow you get a link, and somehow you click a link, and then you become compromised. So you're trying to go after that thing, right? So the methods of links coming in is you may have an email that comes in. Now, I want to talk about there's a difference between this and business email compromise.
Right.
If your email platform is compromised and then I can send email on behalf of Tarun, that's more the kind of email compromise thing. Or actually, you know, it might be domain squatting and then build my own email
Right.
system and make it look like it's Tarun. But the reality is that's one thing, but the other thing is people just sending you links. So you receive the email and it's very targeted to you. It might be, you know, your healthcare. It might look like it's your healthcare provider, but somehow I'm going to click the link and then I end up going to a malicious site. So if you look at the far left here, there's a couple of things. One is if we can do DNS or URL filtering, can we block people when they click it? We can bomb that and say you can't go there. When we talk about the email stuff, having a good email security platform tied into your platform is always good as well. And then device compromise, you know, we're trying to prevent, first of all, creds being stolen. So at Adobe and then with Banyan, we done passwordless. Now think of this. 2019, we're doing passwordless. Now at Adobe, we built our own thing in 2017, right? But 2019, Banyan's out the gates with passwordless. I didn't see passwordless on some of these other leading providers until 3 or 4 years later. So
Right.
the ability to say, hey, we know what we're doing with passwordless, but passwordless for me became important because you can't scrape my creds and reuse my creds. Now, if you do get some malware on your device, having that EDR integration tied in means we can cut the session. Now, as we can kind of come further along, we're now talking about, right, I'm on the network. So I've got think of like two different types of networks. In Starbucks, and I'm just going to all these cloud applications, that's the bottom box, or I'm actually in the office, or I'm on your network. I've connected via VPN, which we don't think is good any longer. You don't need to do that. But let's just say somehow they're in your network. If you're on your office network and your device gets compromised, that means they can move laterally to all the other devices on that network. If you follow the principles of what we were building from an architecture perspective, we were taking any on-prem application and we were making it look and appear like a cloud app. That means networking security on your office network doesn't need to poke a hole into your data center at the app level to access these apps. So you reduce your firewall complexity. You turn all of your office networks into guest networks like Starbucks. You can't see peer-to-peer. You can only get to the internet. And that enables me to get to the apps. So now all of this does when you bring it all together is it says, before you access any application and service, we're going to do a posture check. We're going to make sure you're passwordless. We're going to block you from clicking silly links. We're going to integrate with the EDR tool of choice so that if you do click a link and you get compromised, then it will hopefully tell us. So we're reducing that risk further. And then as we go through and talk about touching apps and services, all these apps and services appear like they're on the internet. So therefore, your office network or your corporate network can become more standardized, just like guest networks at Starbucks. Cookie cutter approach to deploy new offices.
So Dan, are you saying if we implemented all these features in gray, we would stop all the attacks in the world?
No, but I think we would make it way harder for the 80% of those attacks.
Right.
And think of it like this. I remember actually giving slides to my boss and my dotted line boss, so the CSO and the CIO at Adobe, right, Brad and Cindy. And in one of my slides, I'm saying one of the benefits is almost eliminate lateral movement.
Right.
I don't think any leader with any ounce of credibility would ever say, I will eliminate.
Right.
I will prevent. Like those hard, definite things, I think would be nonsense. So for us, it was almost a case of, no, I think we can make it more expensive for the bad guys. And this is the whole thing. Make it more expensive so they go to a cheaper target.
And that is actually really valuable because the bad guys also have limited time. If you make it hard for them, they're just going to move on to the next suspect. So I don't think even zero trust, like even though zero trust claims to this be all end all right now, I don't think any vendor would claim that, hey, we can block 100% of attacks, but we can definitely make it much harder for the attackers. And we can block all the basic kind of attacks. And if you do that, your probability of being breached, your probability of being compromised goes down significantly. At the end of the day, it's a probabilities game, and that's what you're trying to do.
Now, the thing for me is we implemented this strategy. I'd done this at Adobe, I'd done this at Cisco, at Banyan. That was our bread and butter. But the funny thing is, there's a whole lot of knock-on effects for a company that implements this strategy. One is passwordless means I don't change passwords every 90 days, right? With the telemetry that we've got in these systems, you understand if your account has been compromised or not these days, because that whole change your password every 90 days nonsense, that was at a time where we didn't know if your account was compromised or not.
Right. Exactly.
So the best answer we had was you should change it on a regular basis just in case. What's the regular basis? And some idiot, I don't know, 20 years ago went 90 days sounds good. Who came up with that nonsense? So the reality is that's a knock-on effect. Password change related cases in a service desk is one of the top ticket counters they'll have. So if you can eliminate that, and we done that, and I can't remember the stats, but it was like a reduction of 80% of the tickets. So if you look at a company like Adobe, that's a huge number.
Well, it's not just Adobe. I hope our internal IT team is listening to this. I struggle with this every 90 days.
Yeah, because that's the thing. It's bullshit. And actually, and if you look at NIST and what NIST are saying, now, the good thing for us is at Adobe, we done this. At Cisco, we done this. At Banyan, we done this. And the reality is we still passed all of our audits.
Right.
So here's what's interesting. Now, for us at Banyan, the audit was easy because we could use our own platform to prove most of the things were in place. So whether you've got, malware protection, well, we've got policy in place that says unless you have that active, you can't get to this.
Yes.
So we used our own platform for our SOC 2, which was it's a great side benefit to being able to deploy something like this, right? So it worked really well.
Awesome. I see a few questions, but let me do a couple of things before we before we get a little bit further into what exactly zero trust is, let me just do one of the banes of our industry is this thing I call buzzword bingo. So one of the challenges, so so far we've talked about the types of compromises, the impact of the compromises, how a security product could help prevent those compromises. But the challenge with evaluating a security product today is pretty much every security offering is reduced to these buzzwords, right? And so I'm just going to try to not try to hit every single buzzword, but just kind of quickly say, listen, there will always be buzzwords in this industry. But if you double click a little bit, there is some sense behind it. So I'll just try to cover the buzzword bingo, the 5 buzzwords here before we move on. If someone says ZT, they mean zero trust. And zero trust is not a product. No matter what anyone tells you, zero trust is not a product. Zero trust is a philosophy like communism or Marxism, right? It's just, hey, zero trust means do not have implicit trust in the network. Instead, you explicitly authenticate and authorize every request. So zero trust is just a philosophy. So don't buy a zero trust product, maybe buy into the philosophy. Zero trust network access, ZTNA, is a buzzword and a product. That is using private access to your internal networks, but using the zero trust philosophy. SSE stands for Security Service Edge. Security Service Edge is just the idea that you can deliver access to private resources or internet resources, but through the cloud. So essentially, no appliances, no hardware, everything is delivered as a service, as a consumption-based service. That's what is called SSE. SD-WAN stands for Software-Defined Wide Area Networking. If you have many, many branches, headquarters, and you want to connect them all together, you want the network to span branches and headquarters over the internet, that technology is called Software-Defined WAN. And finally, SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, is a combination of SSE and SD-WAN. So sometimes in the world of zero trust, all these acronyms are very intimidating. You're like, hey, I want to solve this security problem. I want to have this outcome, but what acronym do I buy? The reason we put this up is to say, hey, don't be intimidated by the acronyms. They actually just focus on the bingo acronym across the vertical. Everything else nowadays is constituted by those.
Yeah, and look, the reality is it's about solving problems. You're not employed to just turn up every day and go like deploy the best stuff. Or I was going to say, so deploying a tool or technology doesn't solve problems. All it does is it helps you spend money, I guess, and have another tool. And so it doesn't matter what the buzzword of the day is. Right. You still walk in with a mandate to your organization to build strategies to support the business, execute strategies, and move on with your day. And in the external factors, the problem is if you're the CISO at some company right now or the CIO, your bosses are probably knocking on your door saying, hey, what are you doing about zero trust? Right? Because they've seen it in the press, they've heard about it, they hear the buzz. So the thing about the buzzword bingos is the minute the buzzword is out there, and for me, zero trust became a thing when you're watching your mainstream television and you start seeing adverts from these vendors about zero trust, or you hear them talk about it on the television on some shows, right? So for us, we never focused on we're going to do some ZT. We just said, at Cisco, actually, we did for different reasons, but at Adobe, we just said, hey, we're going to stop you from having to use VPN. We're going to stop you from having to enter your password. Do you want to log in less? Right. I've never had that conversation in 30 plus years of asking someone if they would like to log in less. It doesn't seem like you should be even asking the question. You know the bloody answer, right? Of course. So yeah. So removing friction from any company is important. And these external words, because they really come in as external influence more than anything else. Because once Gartner or Forrester start talking about these things or other alliances, then it becomes a mainstream thing, and people start asking, "Are we doing that?" Yeah. Without even necessarily knowing what the bloody thing is, So I got that. I got that a few times over the years. It's like, are we doing zero trust? Like, what do you mean?
I mean, that's a great segue to the next topic, which is let's get a little bit more specific. What is the zero trust you guys keep talking about? And so here is maybe a couple of quick diagrams for the audience to understand when we say zero trust or zero trust network access, what we're talking about. And the general statement is, back in the day, access was pretty simple, as we've talked about. Users come to the office, they access resources in the office. It's pretty simple. But unfortunately, in today's world, most organizations have way more than the office worker, right? They have remote workers, they have contractors. And also the applications don't just run on-prem anymore. They run in the cloud, a lot of SaaS applications, a lot of internet usage. And so your traditional appliance model or building security using appliances has not only become very complicated, the users have more and more, Dan was talking about friction. Users hate the friction. They find workarounds around the friction. And the complicated operations and users bypassing your controls means your security model breaks down. A lot of compromises happen because the most tooling of the last 10, 15 years was just built on the wrong fundamentals. And so a modern zero trust solution essentially it removes that complexity, removes the friction with the user, and instead will have a single platform that doesn't matter where the user is, whether they're in the office or remote, doesn't matter where the application is, whether it's on-premise, in the cloud, or internet resources, you will connect that user to that application securely using the principles we described. And so just to break it down, that's all zero trust is. If anybody else, zero trust data backup, zero trust this, that's all bogus stuff. Just if you think about zero trust from an access control system, it's quite a simple capability.
Yeah. Now we're more than halfway through here, Tarun. So I don't see. Let's ask. So audience, you're allowed to throw questions at Tarun and I, or you can make fun of us. We didn't care either way. But questions would be great. So you're welcome to put them in via the panel.
Let's take one then. Let's talk about this. Like, if a company is all cloud, my company has only cloud resources. We don't have a VPN. We are completely in the cloud. How should we think about security? How should we think about zero trust security if we are just everything is in the cloud?
So that's perfect question, because I was thinking about this. The difference between a big enterprise that's been around for years that has on-prem and cloud and so on and so forth. I think that's how a lot of large enterprises are going to be right now. They're on their journey. But when I went from Cisco to Bang, and then instantly, we were all in the cloud. There was no VPN. So the thing for us was our office network was built like a guest network. All of our big apps and data and all that stuff is all in the clouds. And we still wanted to, first of all, obtain our SOC 2. So that needs some whiz bang magic, right? So we wanted that, but then also on top of that, we wanted to ensure that apps and users were connecting in a seamless way with the assurance that we needed all the way through. So we still done passwordless, we still done posture check, we still done device registration. And if we were going to go to an admin console, as an example, within the IT or security team, we were forcing our gateway because we wanted to get more data from those connections. We wanted to understand and put more policies in play. So I look at it like it's not as much about a VPN replacement. It's really more going back to that 80% of how we're being breached. Exactly. I still want DNS and URL filtering. I still want posture on the device. I still want passwordless. So for me, the VPN piece of it, that was cool. But our quality of our product had really evolved to this posture checking, passwordless, integrated edge client.
I would just add, if you're all cloud, the first thing I would suggest is you have to have multi-factor authentication, right? That is probably the first thing. You have to really get your user. So if you're all cloud, the user becomes the crux of the matter. And so username, password, multi-factor auth is a requirement, but that is the bare basics. Everyone is going to have that. The second step you have to do is device attestation, which is what Dan was talking about. Device posturing, have confidence in the user's device. In fact, I would say if you're all cloud, those two are even more important because those are your only 2 points of control. If you're all cloud and I get your credential, I have unfettered access to all your data. So you don't
Yeah.
even have multiple layers of security. So in that sense, if you're all cloud, you're almost more vulnerable than folks who have a
Yeah,
mix of cloud and
and when
on-premise.
yeah, look, and when you're all cloud, that means your IDP, so your
Yes,
directory, your authentication platform is likely a cloud platform.
yes,
And if you're not doing all the other stuff, MFA is good, and I think that's the basics. But beyond the MFA, because there's MFA fatigue attacks and there's
right,
other ways to bypass it. So beyond MFA, all these other things I think matter.
absolutely. Let's handle one more before I move back into the topic we want to cover, which is my company is really small. Who's going to attack me?
So place all the well, I was looking through stats actually about the small medium businesses, and if you look at the attacks, about 43% of attacks are on the SMB space. So who's going to attack you? Well, unfortunately, what happens is they're going to build a script and they're going to add you with all these other small businesses into one large attack. And it's just a spray and pray. So literally, I'll do a social engineering campaign and I'm just going to attack all the small businesses because they're just lumped in. If you're a larger company, sometimes those are more targeted and thought out and planned
Yeah.
attacks because they've got a specific objective in mind. A lot of these nation states, especially, but ransomware crews and stuff as well. They're going after bigger companies because they want the money. So spray and pray, small businesses. You're just on the list like anybody else. And the problem is you're probably not educating your team. You probably don't have a dedicated security department to understand this. You may not have set up your email security correctly. You may not be getting that service. You may not know that service even exists.
So just to hone in on that. So there are these nation state attacks, and the way I think of nation state attacks is Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. He decides to break into that mainframe. He's going to fly in, swoop in, all of that. But that is a very small subset of attacks. Most attacks are just taking advantage of a product vulnerability, a human pattern. And those are
Yeah.
all spray and pray attacks. If it's a product vulnerability, say on WordPress, 80% of websites are WordPress. I'm going to try every WordPress website in the world. I don't care if it's a small business, medium business, your business, my business. And
Yeah.
if there's a vulnerability, I'm just going to get in there and either install something malicious, install some ransomware. So the size of the business is not that important for these spray and pray attacks, and that's what most attacks are.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you go to haveibeenpwned.com and start throwing in some email addresses of people in your company,
Yeah,
then you will become quite alarmed at what you're going to start to see. So for us, we start to say, well, look, if your creds are already out there in the dark web, which that website will show you,
yeah,
then you're going to start to rethink how important this is. If you put in, let's say your executives' email addresses, their business email addresses, you can become a little alarmed on that one. And I
yeah,
think the reality, Tarun, is we're in a position now where anybody is vulnerable, and that's one of the earlier slides we showed these companies that have been breached. They're just big household names in most cases, but we could probably sit there and throw in like 100 or 1,000 SMB logos.
yeah. So we've spoken a lot about, hey, the types of attacks, how they've changed, how it's important to think about new security tooling to counter these attacks. So let's chat a little bit. Where does one even start, right? Let me just start the slides again. So say I want some zero trust. Okay, then you've convinced me. I need to think a little bit more. My business is small, but I recognize that the threat landscape has changed. I need to invest in a solution. how would I start? Like, I just don't want to go buy a vendor. What else should I be doing? I will buy a vendor eventually, but where do I start?
So yeah, look. So we looked at, and so back in 2017, Beyond Corp was the one thing that was a good reference, and that was what Google had done. But they rebuilt their networks, and we didn't have the Google money. So the thing that we done is we were in charge of all the identity platform. We were in charge of the network security, the endpoint security. So we had it within our control to jump in and look at the authentication workflow, which people hated anyway. Remember that whole log in too many times,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
So we jumped in there and we said, look, let's inject in the authentication workflow the passwordless component. Let's inject into that workflow the device posture component. And then once we've done that, then we determine where we're sending the traffic. We're either going to go to our reverse proxy, which is the thing that replaces a VPN, or we're going to send it to the VPN. So for us,
So then we have a
easy
question. I think
place.
it might be based on your accent, but people want to know, what is the website where you can check the emails to see have they been compromised?
So it's haveibeenpwned.com.
And pwned is spelled P-W-N-E-D.
P-W-N-D.com.
P-W-N-E-D.com. Yeah, I just Googled it. Yeah. So essentially, it's managed by Troy Hunt. It's a good resource. Essentially, if there's any large data leak on the internet, he pulls it into his database, and it's a great place to check it out. I put it in the chat as well. But thanks for that question.
And we've got on our website, we actually just published a thing today, which is for personal protection against cybercrime. Because one of the things I always bitch and moan about in companies is you do your annual security training and no one gives a crap. They're switched off because there's no emotional investment. So we've launched a document about personal protection, which is the thing at Banyan. We used to do employee onboarding, right? We do the one about personal protection, and we talk about this website in that doc. And I always say to companies, focus more on protecting your own assets. As a person, I like the money in my bank, and you understand that to protect your bank account, you want to do second factor. But for some reason, you get grumpy when you go into the office and you have to do second factor. So the reality is we're trying to educate people. Things like this website, it's a great resource. We got that in our little booklet. So yeah.
Right. So then we're running short on time. So let's just wrap up a little bit. So what I would suggest for folks who are interested in Zero Trust is we covered a lot of topics in this presentation, but from a technology perspective, here are some of the key elements on the slide. You need to think about authentication. You need to think about your device management. You want to log your authentication events, your access events. You want endpoint security. You want to think about your network. And I think one of the key things is when you think about a Zero Trust project or buying a product, you must understand the talent, your security team, your IT team, your managed service provider, who's going to help you execute this initiative. And when you put all these things together, it may be in different orders for different organizations. For example, if your authentication is well figured out, you use Entra ID with multi-factor, you can put a check on that, move on to the next one. But when you have thought about all of these and you have established a security posture for your organization where you're satisfied with how these controls are, you can confidently say, I have a Zero Trust program in place. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. And we have many thoughts for you. You're welcome emails. Both Dan and I are available to talk about this. And if you're in the SonicWall family, please reach out to your SonicWall representatives to learn a little bit more about our Zero Trust solutions. We're happy to engage with you there. But thank you so much for joining. And then any parting thoughts before we hang up?
Nope. You can catch me on LinkedIn, and happy to talk with anybody that needs some help.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending, and have a great day.